Over the last probably 3 or 4 years, I've tested a whole range of different types of camera for everyday carry. So obviously looking at using the iPhone, I've sort of tested that, and it has many attributes that make it very good as an everyday camera, but I wanted more from the image quality. So I sort of started this process of testing different options. So I've looked at the 1-inch sensor compact cameras. I've looked at APS-C options from Fuji and Sony. And by looked at, I mean, I've actually lived with these. I've bought them and then sold them, and I've really tested this. And I've actually had 2 full-frame Sony cameras now as well. So when I switch between these, it actually means, with the interchangeable lens type cameras, I'm sort of selling the whole collection, changing the whole thing. So these are sort of big decisions that I've been making through the process of coming to these conclusions. It's one of these things that sort of has no limits in terms of the complexity of decision making around this. There are so many different approaches you can take to solve this problem. So I'm going to look at all of that in this video. But what's interesting is I've gone back to Fuji. So it's actually Fuji were one of the earliest types of camera that I started using, the APS-C sensor Fujis. And I've now just gone full circle and I've gone back to Fuji. I've just bought the XE4. But this time I'm doing something different. And that is that I'm using the 15 to 45mm power zoom optical image stabilizer lens with this camera. And that has completely changed the game in terms of my requirements from an everyday camera. So let's start just by framing what I mean by an everyday camera. And interestingly, it's very close to the way Apple are framing the iPhone in terms of this camera that's always with you. There's no point in a camera if you haven't got it on you. This is kind of the first and foremost principle of this, but also that you're just able to take stills and video with it that get put into your photo library over time. So you build this collection of your family videos and stills and your sort of days out and this kind of roll from the camera. And you're doing that without any processing. You're not developing raw images. There's no pro level workflow here. It's just point and shoot and it builds up into your library. So over time, the interesting thing about this is just how important the color on those pictures are. Resolution, 12 megapixels is more than enough for a nice photo in a library. But the thing you look back on over time is the quality of the image, that sort of out of camera color. So it's very important to me that we're talking about a camera that has good out of camera color, and this is especially important for video. Obviously you have the potential, like with stills, where you have the raw option. Many cameras have these log profiles that let you record huge dynamic range, and you can tweak those colors afterwards with post-processing and come up with all kinds of interesting things. That's not what this is about. We need good quality color in the video straight out of camera. So in terms of video, I think the 2 most important things from this camera need to be that it's stabilized enough to get rid of the jitters when you're doing handheld video. This is crucial, but what's interesting about this is it's definitely enough just to take the jitters out. It doesn't need to be so good that you can walk around with the camera. Those kinds of things are not so important. At the end of the day, getting a nice shot just in video is enough to add that memory to the library. I don't need to be walking around. If I'm doing anything kind of really actiony like that, there's always an action camera or an iPhone for those kinds of things. Really just adding the quality stuff to the library is my main goal, and taking the jitters out of handheld is enough. So that's important to the thing that I've realized, that you don't need crazy stabilization for video. You just need enough. And that perspective has actually been quite significant in this whole conversation. The other thing that I've come to realize is that having a zoom lens in an everyday camera is really useful. So if you're, a day at the beach or whatever with your family, you're not in control of where your subjects are. You can't always constantly chase your kids around to get the framing that you want. So having the zoom lets you reframe without constantly moving your position. Of course, this is useful for any kind of travel situation where you're exploring new territory. You want to create a composition. You can't always get up close to a subject. It's very useful having a zoom lens. Now, of course, the normal trade-off with zoom lens is that you don't get that super shallow depth of field that you can achieve with prime lenses. And this is where lens equivalency comes in, because there are some options in all of this where you can actually get really quite shallow depth of field with a zoom lens. And interestingly, they seem to be on both ends of the spectrum of camera sensor size. So things like the LX100, which I'm going to talk about at the end of this video, has got an f1.7 on a micro four thirds sensor, and that gives you really quite a shallow depth of field. And then obviously at full frame, you've got the f2.8 zooms, which again give you very shallow depth of field in a zoom lens. But the problem with those full frame ones is you're talking about a very big, very heavy camera and lens combination. But in terms of that depth of field, one of the ways that I like to use my everyday cameras is to take portraits of my kids, candid portraits, you know, where you just see a nice light and you just want to take a snap of the kids and get a really shallow depth of field, get the, you know, the background separation, just make it about the kids, make it about that portrait. And some of the best pictures I've taken of my kids have been with a fast prime lens. I'm just literally pointing and shooting in a candid environment, but I'm using a really fast lens, you know, wide open with a fast shutter speed. There's no need for any stabilization in that type of a picture. It's just a still photo. And what's interesting is I haven't found the need for that level of depth of field in video. And this is just such an important realization. Those kinds of things are great for stills, for portraits. It's less important to me for video. And that's crucial to the way that I'm framing this. So then we've got this requirement for the camera to be good at YouTube video. And this is really interesting because nothing reveals problems with camera color more than skin tones. And you know, you've got this A-roll shot all the time where you're looking at your own skin tone and you think something's off, you know, and the only time I've managed to get a good color for this kind of a shot, there's two ways that you can look at this. One is if you use log profiles, and that applies to any camera, and then you use something like the Leeming LUTs, which are color corrected LUTs to get you back to neutral, and that will make any camera that can film in a log profile look pretty good and neutral. And you know, you see some channels that just more or less use that, maybe with a little bit of contrast adjustment, but it's not, there's no real look to it. It's not sort of doing anything interesting. So I wanted to get good color, but I wanted to have something slightly interesting as well. So when I was using the Sony cameras, I actually started using these film simulation profiles. So the Sony cameras actually have a lot of power and control inside. And there's this website that has put together all of these film simulation settings for Sony cameras. And that's really interesting. The trouble with that is they're definitely on the very stylized side of things, these film simulations. And I had quite a lot of fun with them, but I was still kind of thinking it's slightly a bit too stylized. It's just, you know, it's a little bit too much in that kind of very creative look territory, which you can kind of achieve yourself with LUTs and things like that. I wanted something a little bit more restrained, a little bit more subtle, but still with a slight look to it. And that's what's interesting about Fuji cameras with their film simulations. You know, looking back at all of my YouTube videos on this channel over the last few years, it's the color that strikes me as the thing I've struggled with the most. So many of my videos have got weird color. You know, it's either because I'm experimenting with some film simulation, or you know, experimenting with some random old camera that has no options and it's got bad color. We'll get more onto that at the end of this video, actually. But you know, looking back, it's clear to me that color is the most important part of this, and this applies to looking at my family photo library as well. You know, it's the ones where I had good out of camera color. Interestingly, the iPhone is very good at that. It really does a good job of the whole point and shoot thing, where you can just put a picture or a video into your library with no processing and it looks good. Again, much more on the side of sort of looking good rather than any specific look. It's very kind of quite neutral still. But in terms of that, you know, obviously they've got the Dolby Vision thing where they're kind of using the computational stuff to grade that footage. So every shot is continually being adjusted. This is all very interesting for this kind of a role. Obviously, the direction we're taking this by going to a more dedicated camera is that we're using less computational stuff and more relying on the sort of fundamental what is coming out of the camera just through its own inherent qualities. And then, of course, there's this set of basic lines in the sand requirements for YouTube that everybody says you need. You need a screen that flips out to face you. You need a microphone input. You need good continuous autofocus. And the continuous autofocus thing, of course, is the reason everyone switches to Sony, myself included. You know, you do a take and you see it hunting and you're like, can you live with this? No, you know, let's just go to Sony and they'll fix the problem. And they do. Of course, the video autofocus on Sony's is just spectacularly good. But they've still got this problem of color, which we're going to touch more on as the video goes on. So before we talk about why the Fujifilm APS-C sort of promise is so interesting in terms of an everyday camera, we need to get our teeth into this idea of sensor size and how that affects portability. So on the one hand, you've got iPhones with tiny sensors, but are incredibly small cameras, basically. And of course, they happen to be pushing very hard in terms of the computational stuff now. So they've got insane processors and they can do crazy stuff with the images that they capture. So you've got very interesting things happening at that end of the spectrum. Then at the other end of the sensor size spectrum, you've got medium format cameras, which have huge sensors with hundreds of megapixels and take sort of fine art grade image quality pictures. And then in between, you've got things like the 1-inch small sensor, slightly bigger than an iPhone. Then you've got micro four thirds, and then you've got APS-C, and then you've got full frame. And full frame is the kind of standard. When we discuss lenses and cameras, we talk about them in terms of full frame equivalents. So we've got this kind of benchmark, a reference point of full frame, which is actually not the biggest sensor. It's smaller than medium format, but it's generally a lot bigger than all of those other smaller crop sensors. We refer to those as crop sensors. We refer to full frame as kind of a standard. And then there's medium format, which is bigger than full frame. But the interesting thing about sensor size is you think in terms of the lens. So the lens has to create a circle, an image that is big enough to go over that sensor. The bigger the sensor, the bigger the circle of image that needs to be projected onto that sensor for you to get your picture out of it. And this is really interesting because the reality is the bigger the circle, the bigger the lens. So this is what sort of dictates. It's not just the size of the sensor and the camera that makes the cameras bigger. You have to extend this through to the optics as well. So a full frame lens is bigger than a lens you can fit on a micro four thirds. And this sort of process is what's shaped these different sensor size in terms of the markets that they go after and the sort of size of the body and lens combinations that are available with these different sensor sizes. So in simple terms, the bigger the sensor, the bigger the pixels can be given the same megapixel count. And this is what's important in terms of image quality, because the bigger the pixel, the more light it can gather, the bigger the dynamic range in the image, and the better low noise performance you get in low light. So there's another really important thing to look at in terms of the pixel size, the pixel density, and that's the impact on the lens itself. So you've got two factors at play here. One is the resolution that the lens has to achieve. So the smaller the sensor, the sharper that lens needs to be to focus the detail on a smaller physical size. And then we've got diffraction. So the smaller the pixel, the sooner you're going to get this issue from diffraction as you work with smaller apertures. So the smaller the sensor, the less you can actually use your camera, sort of full range of apertures. So if you wanted to get a broader depth of field for a landscape picture, you would suffer from diffraction sooner on a smaller sensor camera. So there's all of these kinds of compromises as you try and shrink down the camera in terms of portability versus the bigger sensors. So there's one more area in terms of sensor size that we need to consider, and that's the ability to get shallow depth of field given a certain framing of your subject. So this idea of taking a nice portrait of your kids with a shallow depth of field, and of course this is recognized in the iPhone territory. So with iPhones, they fake this. They will give you an option, portrait mode, that gives you a fake shallow depth of field and blurs the background out. And it's fun, and it's a feature that they're proud of because it lets you take this style of picture, which is desirable. The best pictures I've taken of my kids have had the shallowest depth of field. It's a very interesting way of taking a portrait, and it's definitely a characteristic that I want to pursue with my camera requirements. So where this gets interesting in terms of sensor size is a lens of a given aperture will allow you to get a shallower depth of field at the same framing of your subject. So let's say we're talking about a full frame camera with an f1.8 lens at 50 millimeters, which is actually a really lovely focal length and depth of field for a portrait. If I take an f1.8 lens and put it on an APS-C camera, I'm cropping in on that sensor, which means to get the same framing, I need to push my subject further back. And of course that means I get a broader depth of field, because obviously the closer the subject is to the camera, the shallower your depth of field. So that's the mechanism by which this is relevant. A lot of people say, oh, bigger sensors give you shallower depth of field. Technically they don't. It's just that the fact that you're cropping in on the smaller sensors forces you to reframe by pushing the subject further away. That gives you the impact on the depth of field. So this is why we talk in terms of equivalency. So to get that look of a 1.8 on full frame, you need an even faster lens on APS-C. This kind of doesn't really happen. It's more the other way around. So actually you can get an f2.1 equivalent full frame with an f1.4 on an APS-C. And this is what's interesting about the Fuji lineup, is we have all of these 1.4 lens prime lenses that give you this f2.1 equivalent, which is very shallow depth of field, perfect for portraits. I don't think you need to pursue much shallower than that. That's enough, So that's what's interesting about the APS-C lineup from Fuji, is this collection of prime lenses with f1.4 apertures. So on the face of it, the Fuji lineup, the Fuji Promise, seems to answer this requirement perfectly. We've got all these super fast prime lenses, which will give us the lovely shallow depth of field that we're after for the portraits. We've got incredible out of camera color, and we've got amazing video performance as well. But the problem is, it gets really complicated really quickly, and it all comes down to stabilization. And this is what I've been agonizing over these years with the Fuji lineup. And the reality is, this 15 to 45mm lens is the thing that completely reframes all of this and opens the door for a completely different way of looking at this. So we should start by looking at the X100 series Fuji, which is the one that gets all the attention. These cameras are stunning. They get all the attention from the EDC community in terms of being this ultra compact, incredible image quality camera, wonderful for stills. It's only the version 6 that has had in-body stabilization. Everything before that has no stabilization at all. There's no optical stabilization in that fixed prime lens on the camera. So only the version 6 is actually any good for handheld video. The problem we then start to look at is that the version 6 has got this new sensor, which is a massive 40 megapixel sensor. It has a crop in its high quality 4K video mode, which takes that fixed prime lens even tighter to something like a 43mm full frame equivalent. What I'm filming on now is a 23mm. In this small room, a 43mm would be way too tight. So there's this restriction in the X100 series. And then on top of that, this new sensor has worse rolling shutter. So when you're sort of running around trying to get videos of your kids and your family, you get this wobbly effect. And this is something I try and get cameras that are good performers in terms of rolling shutter. The X106 is kind of worse than the previous generation Fujis when you're talking about this high quality 4K mode that is downsampled from the 6.3K image. So it starts to look like a bit of a compromise. You know, you've got the fixed prime lens, you've got this sort of potentially worse for video sensor, and of course, ultimately, it hasn't got a flippy screen either. So it starts to look like a bit too much of a compromise. And of course, the X106 is a really expensive camera. There are Fuji body and lens combinations that can be had for way cheaper than this with the last generation sensor, which is arguably better performance for video. You know, you're paying a lot for this all-in-one sort of, you know, super stylish form factor of the X100 series. And then what's hilarious about the X100 series is they're almost always sold out, and if you want one, you've got to buy it secondhand, and then you end up paying a premium. These things are selling more secondhand than they were when they're new because of this supply and demand issue. So it's a very interesting camera, but it's full of compromises and it's very expensive. So from there, we can start looking at the Fuji bodies that have IBIS, which is in-body image stabilization, which will let you get handheld video without the jitters. You know, and to in the different cameras, the effectiveness of this in-body stabilization varies. I don't think it's the kind of thing that you want to just sort of really think you can run around with the camera. It's not good enough for that, but it gets the jitters out, which is my sort of primary requirement for this anyway. So there are a range of Fuji bodies that have this. The trouble is they're really quite big and really quite heavy bodies. The smallest one is the XS20, not that heavy, but it does have the big hand grip, which obviously is actually quite good for ergonomics and usability, but if you're chucking it in a bag, it really changes the way you can fit it in a bag. And this struck me with the XE4 that I've got here. It has no grip at all. It's kind of really flat on the edges, and then you've got your lens in the middle. If you put that in a bag, the bag can really conform around that shape. So you've got your lens in the middle, and then the bag can taper off at the top and the bottom. If you put a big hand grip on the camera at the top, that really stops that. It turns it into a square, and the bag can't then conform. So it's actually quite significant in terms of its sort of portability in this sense. And the other problem I have with the XS20 is it uses the PASM dial layout on the top, which I just don't think is appealing as the rangefinder style with the separate dials on the top, like the X100V and the XE4 that I'm filming on now. So if we reframe this and we start including the Fuji bodies that don't have in-body stabilization, we end up looking at the XE4, which is the most compact body that they do. Bizarrely, they've discontinued it. This is what's crazy about this whole thing. So it's a discontinued model, but it is a generation 4 sensor, which means it's got the better performance in terms of rolling shutter with no crop in the downsampled high quality 4K image quality than even the X106 with the newer sensor. It doesn't have the newest processor, so you don't have all of the AI, autofocus, subject detection stuff. I can live without that. You don't have the 6K open gate, so you don't have this option to record in the 6K and then choose your framing later. I can also live without that. What you do get is a viewfinder, a flippy forward screen, the mic input, and the rangefinder top dial layout, and the ability to use any lens on it. This is all very interesting, but of course the problem is it doesn't have stabilization, so you can't use these lovely fast Fuji prime lenses for handheld video. But this is what's so interesting here, is that this is an interchangeable lens camera. There's nothing stopping us using a zoom lens for video with optical stabilization in it. And it's interesting because actually when I was using this Lumix, this is optically stabilized lens in here, no IBIS. It struck me that this is good enough. This optical stabilization on the optics is good enough for handheld video. And then I found the 15 to 45mm Fuji lens, which has optical stabilization. This is a 135 gram lens. It's incredibly cheap. It's very small. It's very light. It has optical stabilization. The existence of this lens changes the entire outlook on the Fuji bodies without IBIS. So I was like looking around YouTube for trying to find samples of handheld video with this lens to see if this optical stabilization was good enough to take those jitters out of the handheld video. I found a few. It's one of these lenses that no one talks about. Everyone thinks it's just a chuck it away kit lens. It's like, actually, if you look at the people that have done the tests on this lens, this is an incredible lens. It's super sharp, corner to corner. It's incredibly small, incredibly light, and very affordable. It's like this incredible lens that everybody overlooks, but just opens up the Fuji lineup completely for this role of an EDC camera. You can slap this lens on it, you can get handheld stabilized video, you can get lovely stills, and of course you can just take it off and stick a prime on if you want to do nice portraits. So it really uses the benefits of the APS-C interchangeable lens format with the Fuji bodies, lets you choose the smallest, lightest Fuji body, but still lets you have all of these things that we've set out in our requirements here. So of course with this lens, it's not very fast. It doesn't have a very fast aperture, which means you're not going to get that super shallow depth of field for portraits with the zoom lens. But of course we've said that actually that's much less important for video, and we can easily switch to a prime lens, which is super small. And the weight saving from getting a body without IBIS is almost enough to offset the weight of having an additional prime lens. And of course you get the ability to use the zoom lens for travel and family videos and stills, which is super versatile and useful. And this is a full standard zoom range. It's a 23 to 69mm zoom range, which is brilliant. You know, you can obviously crop it a little bit for stills if you wanted to sort of get a still photo with a little bit more reach. It's got the detail, it's 26 megapixel sensor. There is croppability there for stills. For video, it is what it is, and even at the 69mm equivalent, you can hold it still and it doesn't wobble about. It's enough of optical stabilization to get handheld video even at full zoom. It's probably not quite good enough to sort of start moving the camera around at full zoom. At wide angle, it is. You can move it around slowly and carefully. It's not enough to obviously walk around or do a vlog style with the walk. It's going to be far too jittery for that. But it is enough to get this incredible Fuji image quality in a handheld video format. The interesting thing about this lens is obviously you can't use it for getting that super shallow depth of field. So it means that the video requirements of this setup are based on this lens. I can't get that super shallow depth of field in video. But actually the reality of getting that super shallow depth of field in video means you need one heck of a neutral density filter on the front of that if you want to preserve that 180-degree shutter angle, which is what gives you that smooth, sort of natural looking video. To do that, you need this neutral density filter on the front of it. Actually, for general family video rolls where you just want to use the aperture to get the right exposure, you don't want to faff about with the neutral density filter, you're not pursuing depth of field in video anyway. This is what I've sort of realized over the years. I sort of had this in my mind, oh, it would be lovely to get video with this shallow depth of field. Actually pulling that off means, because the aperture is letting so much light in, you need huge thick neutral density filters on the front, and you take them on and off all the time. It's generally a layer of hassle that I don't think is really worth it compared to just using a lens like this for video and then switching to a prime for stills if you want to get that lovely portrait look. So it's worth just mentioning smaller cameras, and how close they're getting to sort of meeting these requirements, because the industry has just moved away from them, I think, because most people are just sort of living with their iPhone instead of using the smaller cameras. If they are making the switch, they're going up to something in the APS-C sort of range as a minimum. But cameras like this LX100, I picked this up off eBay for sort of just over £300. Really interesting camera, and what's interesting about it is there is actually a current version of this under the Leica brand, the Deluxe 8. So it's got more megapixels than this version and apparently improved color, which is the biggest problem with this. It has no option to record in any log profiles for video or anything like that. You're stuck with the color out of camera for video. Obviously it can shoot raw, so if you're shooting stills with it and you're happy with that workflow, you could live with it in that respect. But we know we're really after this kind of out of camera into the library workflow here with all of this. So unfortunately it didn't make the grade, but I wanted to experiment with it just because it's such an interesting form factor. So what's fascinating about this is an f1.7 aperture at the wide end of this built-in zoom lens. That gives me actually a shallower depth of field even than this Fuji on its APS-C sensor, with the f3.5 aperture on this APS-C equivalency. So for a shallow depth of field for the portrait thing, this is almost enough to not even worry about using prime lenses, which of course you can't do because this is fixed. So it comes very close to actually solving the kind of one and done perfect camera, but it unfortunately doesn't quite make the grade just because of this color issue. If the Leica version has got improved enough color, you could quite seriously consider this, I think, but then really the 4K video is a long way off what you get from the Fuji, and of course the still image quality is still a long way off what you get from the Fuji. So It's a great attempt at this, but just kind of too many compromises really, versus just going up to something like this Fuji setup, which is a little bit bigger and a little bit heavier all round, but with so much better image quality. If you've enjoyed my take on this, you'll love the way I approach my day job, which is working on a CMS website platform with Chris Parnell in New Zealand. So we're creating this amazing system that solves real life problems for small and medium businesses in terms of their websites and managing their customer data. It's got incredible CRM tools integrated very tightly into the website content management tools itself. And we've got an advanced, powerful development layer within inside the system that we can use to solve real life problems specific to your requirements. So if you're looking to upgrade your website and integrate that as a part of a solution that integrates your customer data and the functionality that your customers have through your website, we can do all kinds of interesting things. So give me or Chris a shout at setseed.com. As ever, thanks so much to all the members on this channel. Your support means so much to me and really makes it possible for me to do these videos. You now get access, as well as early access to my videos, you get access to my Zettelkasten Notes Vault, which includes all of the research, and it's all linked together that I do for these videos, as well as all the other things that I'm exploring in my life as well. So hopefully as time goes on, this is going to become a really interesting resource for you as well as me. There's never been a better time to become a member if you enjoy the videos that I make. It's super appreciated. I'll link to a video on the screen here, and I'll see you there.